Good evening, everyone. I do apologize that, first of all, this video is so late into the second week of classes, and secondly, for what is not my office. As you can now see, I have a friend who had a family emergency, and I am taking care of her animals and her child for a little bit. So I am unfortunately recording from a completely different place than I did the last time that we talked, but I will be back in my own office very soon. For now, this one will have to do. I wanted to talk about chapters 1 and 2 because last week I had on there that you should be reading through chapter 1, and then this week was chapter 2. Why did I do it that way? Is it because the book says we should do it that way? Partially, maybe, I guess, but also partially because this book is pretty straightforward. I don't think it's real hard for you to pick out what things might be important from chapter 1 and chapter 2. They italicize, put it at the end of the chapter for you, give you questions. It's pretty clear. So I don't want to spend a lot of time rehashing the book. What I'd like to do instead is to highlight some of the things in the book and perhaps give some other explanations for them. In addition, give you some new information as well. So sit back and relax. I'm hoping that this won't take too long. However, I have been known to put more than one person to sleep in my time. So hang in there with me. So chapter 1 is an introduction to just what argument is. Of course, when people talk to me and they say, I don't want to argue, my response is then we might as well not be communicating because to me, everything is an argument that is made. Does that make me inherently argumentative? Well, as your book points out, not necessarily. To say that I do appreciate argument says that I appreciate not just having an idea or an opinion, but knowing what's behind that. Not that you have to provide evidence for everything that you do, but that maybe it's not such a bad idea to say, I think this because, instead of just, I think this. What happens when somebody just puts a claim out there and says, I believe this to be true, and they don't put anything behind it? We tend to say, explain to me where you get that from, or why. And immediately it puts the other person on the defense. They begin to think they're being criticized, or that somehow we, by asking that question of, well, where's your evidence, that we are saying that their claim is automatically not true. And that's not what most people are doing when they say why, or tell me about that, or tell me more about that, or can you explain why you believe what you believe, or you think what you think, or your experiences have been what your experiences have been. So the first thing that puts people off in a conversation is argument. And the second thing is being challenged when they do engage in a conversation. So right off the bat, everything that we're taught about attempting to gain identification with the people that we're conversing with, or with an audience that we're giving a speech to, and so on, is just completely wiped out if you consider an argument to be a negative thing. So it's difficult in the world that believes that argument is not a good thing to say, oh, no, academically speaking, argument is a great thing. I've run into that a lot, and it's completely and 100% understandable. So why would I have you study this? Why do we put this in the core of our program? Well, because whether or not people say they don't like to make arguments, they constantly are. And secondly, knowing what they are and how to respond to them, it doesn't require us to point them out and say, haha, that's an argument. I mean, we don't need to do that, but we can be able to communicatively maneuver through arguments in the public sphere and amongst our peers very easily if we understand how argument actually works. I'm going to take us back to about 400 BCE. with Aristotle. Aristotle had a big problem with his dissertation advisor. That's the way I always put that. The running joke is that my dissertation advisor and I did not ever get along, not even for a minute at any point in time. And that's not entirely true, but I definitely have some different thoughts than he does. What made us such a great team is that we were able to use both sides, my argument and his, to come to a better answer. Plato and Aristotle said that they wanted to do the same thing. I should take that back. Plato didn't want to debate it. Plato thought he was right. Aristotle, on the other hand, he wanted to argue about it. And this tells you something about Aristotle and Plato's idea of rhetoric. Plato believed that there was no room for debate or argument, that what he said had to be accepted as true. Aristotle said, no, wait a minute, we should probably have a discussion about this and put it into the public sphere to figure out what we really think. Because what is the good of a claim if you don't have an argument against it? And think about that for a second. What good is a claim if you don't have an argument against it? If you don't have an argument against something, then you don't need to make the claim in the first place. So Aristotle was kind of arguing with his academic advisor, so to speak, the same way that a lot of us do. Now, let's fast forward to approximately late 1700s in the United States, okay? And there is a man who has been chosen to, quote unquote, rule, that is to say, govern the new United States of America. And that is, of course, George Washington. And some of you may know what's coming. George Washington was notorious for having Jefferson and Hamilton debate each other. And the reason he did it was because he believed, having them in his cabinet, he would have two of the best minds making the best arguments for why something should be done one way or another. In fact, if you look at some of the letters from Hamilton and Jefferson, they have some regrets in saying, we didn't really want to argue about this, but Washington forced us into it because he wanted to hear both sides of the debate. That sounds either mean or selfish on Washington's part. I leave it to you to determine what you think. Personally, I like it. It's the way I live my life. Whenever someone is struggling with a debate in a group setting or in an audience, they're realizing that they're not making the headway that they want to make, I always say, put an idea out there that can be countered. Don't be afraid to have someone disagree with you. If you have disagreement, then you have a good discussion. And if you have a good discussion, that probably means there's some good arguments in there, which means you're going to come to the best conclusion possible. That was what Washington wanted. And our system here in the United States, despite what blasphemy we have turned it into, is based on the idea that competing arguments are important to a functioning democracy. And there has to be opposition. So if somebody says, I'm shutting you down, we're not going to talk about that thing, or we're not going to consider that possibility of a claim or an explanation, then what they are doing is no longer engaging in debate. They are no longer engaging in a democratic principle. And they are no longer engaging you. In other words, this whole word cancel, the idea of cancel culture, is driving me up a wall. Partially because if you cancel one side of a debate, then what's the point of the other side? Why does it exist? Why is it there? But more importantly, how do you have a democracy when you just have one side always agreed upon with no question, with no challenge, with no modification? And the answer is that is no longer a democracy. So argument is actually from 400 BCE forward a key part of a functioning democracy. I say functioning. We are still one of those, believe it or not. I know people don't think we are all the time, but we are. So why is that important to you? I mean, surely the great debate about democracy is probably not on the forefront of your mind unless you're a complete and utter nerd like myself and you're involved in that sort of thing, which, by the way, that's totally cool. But if you're thinking to yourself, I'm not taking a government class, I'm taking an argument class, I get that. But everything that we encounter every day requires us to understand the form and function of argument, okay? Whenever you watch a television ad, that is an argument. Here's why you should buy our t-shirts or telephone or our service product, okay? Every time that you engage in a debate in your classroom, that is an argument that does something. It's an argument. It's not necessarily a, devastating argument for which you can never show your face in public again. Obviously not, but it's a productive argument. Okay. So you encounter arguments every single day. And yes, I fight with my mother a lot on the phone, which is why I live 1,000 miles away from her. Thank you very much. But love her to death. But we argue all the time. And as I've grown, we've had to learn how to, argue in a way that's productive, not in a way that's destructive. And that's interpersonal argument. In this class, we will not be discussing interpersonal argument. You don't want to learn that from me. Believe me, I'm terrible at it. I think that Dr. Bauman or Dr. Dillon or somebody is much better suited to that conversation. What we're interested in is understanding public argument. How arguments get made, how they are received, and how they are debated in the public sphere. Now, you may have gotten that sense from the book. At least I hope you got that sense from the book. Right now, you may hear my phone buzzing, and I'm going to tell you that my phone is buzzing because there are people trying to convince me to get on city council. And it's not working so far. But see, they keep texting because they think if I'm not answering, that must mean that I'm considering it. Because no one ever thinks I'm just busy. So it happens all the time on an interpersonal and on a public level. We encounter these debates. Now, of course, chapter 1 outlines the two different kinds of argument. I think there's probably a lot more, but I'm okay with us dealing with two types of argument. One being, how do we get this decision made? How do we get policy changed? And the other being, how do we keep our society together? For those of you who are particularly astute, you may understand that if you study small group communication, you ask the same questions. A successful small group gets the job done, it's task-oriented, and it also keeps the group together. So it's also people-oriented. So in the same way that arguments are supposed to do two things as well. They are supposed to help us understand the debate, the question, the different arguments for something or against something. But they are also for the purpose of sort of allowing us to weave our ideas together. They're definitely not always symmetrical. Sometimes you have to give more than you take, as an example. So when we say give and take in an argument, sometimes the give is literally, I'm going to agree with you on one thing, and then from there on, it's just a disagreement, and that's okay. Because what we're going to learn about is that to agree or disagree on premises is very, very different than when we agree or disagree at the level of the claim. All right, and that's a few weeks down the road yet. Chapter 2 is an interesting chapter. I've debated on whether or not I like the idea of introducing narrative as argument early in a semester or not, and this is the first time I'm teaching argumentation online, as I've told you. So let's go for it, right? I thought, wow, it's been a while since I've read Fisher, so that's good. The truth of the matter is that your book is not wrong. Every time we make an argument, for the most part, we're telling a story. Or in reverse, when we tell a story, we're often making an argument. Let me give you an example. I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to get some water, and then I'm going to tell you a story. Some of you may have noticed and may have been distracted by the fact that I'm missing a tooth on this side of my mouth, on the top, and every time I open my mouth, you can see it. And you may be wondering, wow, that's just weird. My professor doesn't have a tooth there, and it's really distracting. Who would do that? And the answer to that question is that I have a screw in my jaw, and it's waiting for the implant to be delivered. So that's part of the reason why, and I've been waiting a long time for that. But then the question becomes, why did I have to lose the tooth in the first place, right? So I'm going to tell you that I am, a little self-disclosure. I have a lot of it. I'm very, very low threshold for sharing information. I suffer from 4 autoimmune diseases, not the least of which includes something called sarcoidosis and something called diabetes. Now, you don't need to know that for the test. You also don't need to know the following. I'm on cancer drugs, chemotherapy drugs. I say cancer drugs or chemotherapy drugs, depending on who I'm talking to. People understand those terms very differently. But I'm on chemotherapy every week, once a week. All of those things combined, my teeth can barely survive in my mouth. And you combine my really, really bad genetics from my father, and teeth are just not something I ever thought I'd still have at the ripe age of 48. But I do. It's taken a lot of maintenance. It's taken a lot of work, but I do. My dentist keeps telling me to preserve as much of my teeth as I can, which is why when this one needed to be taken out, he was really not wanting to do it. He thought, you didn't take care of this tooth. I told you there was going to be a problem. And he did. For like 3 years, he kept saying, this tooth is going to be a problem for you. And I kept saying, it's fine. I don't feel anything. The evidence you have is counterintuitive to the experiences that I'm having. Therefore, even though you might be the more credible source, I'm completely ignoring you. And then there I was getting that tooth pulled in an emergency situation. So we're waiting for this tooth to come in, and I don't know when it's going to happen. But I wanted to tell you that story because it may tell you some more information about me. Maybe not information that you need specifically for the information's sake, but maybe it tells you something about my personality and how argumentative I can be. In addition, it also should teach you a lesson that when your dentist says that tooth is going to be a problem for you, that instead of ignoring him or her or they, you should in fact get it checked out and work with it. Especially if you have other compounding factors that are really going to make it difficult for that tooth to make it and serve you well for the rest of your life. Is that a story about my values and me and who I am and what I do? Or is that a story that's an argument about taking care of your teeth? I'm just going to let you think on that. Stories function as both argument and as a functional way of not just doing that argument, but a functional way for us to relate to each other, to identify with each other, if you will. What's interesting to me is that books always do this. They always do this. They say the narrative paradigm is, and I have to stop and I have to remind myself that back when I was in school, they used to say, well, the narrative paradigm says this. Narratives have 2 parts that are particularly important. They have to hang together and make sense internally, but they also have to be relatable realistic in some way. And there are two words for that. And your book outlines what those two words are. And for some reason, I am blanking right this second, which is awful because I've studied it for far too long. Fidelity and probability. I knew it was something. How well does the story hang together? How truthful does it sound? Because of the way the story is told, that's the fidelity. And then, of course, the probability is what's the likelihood that this story is actually true, or that the moral of the story is true. And I say moral, I mean the argument. Okay. We used to talk about narratives, stories, plays, etc., in terms of the moral argument, the moral that you learn at the end of the story. But really, it's not about learning a moral. It's about someone making an argument to you about what you should and should not do. In the story of the tortoise and the hare, one of Aesop's famous fables, where the hare runs really, really fast and he's gloating and he makes fun of the turtle because the tortoise, I should say, the tortoise is just moseying along. The bunny has to rest, but the tortoise has kind of been, resting the whole time. So the tortoise gets to the end of the race before the hare. Now, would a rabbit and a tortoise ever actually race in nature? Probably not. If they did, would the tortoise win? No, it would not, if we could make that happen. But that's not the point, right? The argument that's being made is that if you take your time and you keep moving forward, you may get there faster and better than the people who are rushing through things and not paying attention to it, right? So the tortoise and the hare, is about slow and steady wins the race and all that, but it's also about appreciating the things in life that help us take our time as we go along towards the end of it, right? So I said to my son the other day, he's 20, and I said, a stitch in time saves 9. And he looked at me like I had 8 heads, and I had to explain to him that back in the olden days when we used to hand stitch things, I still hand stitch things sometimes, that if you rushed through it, you might do it incorrectly, and then you have to undo it and go back and do it again. But if you take your time and you do a stitch at a time, then you're probably going to get it right, thereby saving yourself the trouble of undoing a bunch of stitches to redo them again anyway. He needed a different metaphor. Those are metaphors within narratives, right? The story is an allegorical comparison to something else. It's not about the argument that's made in the story. It's about the argument that you're supposed to interpret from the story. Arguments work the same way. And what's difficult is when we're talking to someone and they're telling us stories and we pull out the main argument and we try to argue back, perhaps with another story. Identifying the argument is usually the first problem that we have. Your book talks a little bit about that and does not seem to really answer the question that I always start every study of the narrative paradigm with, which is, if it's not the narrative paradigm, what's the other paradigm? And it's actually an easier answer than we probably anticipate. It's called the rational world paradigm. And the rational world paradigm is a term that we've had to give to the way that we've gone about thinking in Western thought, the way that we've gone about doing science before Walter Fisher came along and said, hey, we can think about things a different way. We never needed a name for the way that we thought until somebody brought up another way of thinking, a different perspective. And now all of a sudden we needed to name it. So we have the rational world paradigm and we have the narrative paradigm. And what's the difference between those two? Well, the rational world paradigm is very limiting in the sense that only things that are presented in a deductive or inductive way and follow the strict rules of argument structure set out by some guy in 400 BCE, so some 2,400 years ago, that he somehow had it right, and we just keep thinking that way. But what we've learned over time is that people don't think in terms of the scientific method. Most of the time, we think of the world and make sense of the world via the narrative. So when it comes to making sense of the world, or literally what we call sense making, walking around in the world and going, okay, that makes sense that that tree is not on top, is uprooted and stands on its head. Making sense of complicated issues like what's going to happen in the 2024 election. Do we still have a functioning democracy? Should healthcare be expanded? Is there any way to solve the inflation problem? You'll notice that nowadays we hear from economists, we hear from statisticians, we hear from people who are in the government, we hear from experts from banks, we hear about all these different people brought together to explain their point of view about inflation. And then most of all, we listen to the stories. How much did I pay for gas at the pump today? How much are groceries going up? Why is it I can't afford quinoa anymore? That's a running joke. And if you're following any political campaign outside of Missouri, particularly in Pennsylvania, you don't know what crudité is either. And that's because those don't exist in our narrative world, in the world of experience, not the world of book study, but the world of experience. Most often, I'm not saying always for sure, that's definitely not the truth. More often than not, let's try it that way, we talk about things from the point of view of the narrative paradigm. We engage the rational world paradigm when we feel like it's necessary in our classrooms, and when we're writing papers, when we're taking exams. And there are even debates about whether or not you should use the rational world paradigm or the narrative paradigm, looking at how something fits into the story of our social world versus what do the numbers say. It's important for us to understand that narratives are arguments too. Part of the reason for that is because a lot of scholars talk about argument in terms of storytelling. And whenever we tell a story, we're making that argument. So I have friends who say to me, let me ask you a question. Here's my question. And I say, well, and then I go into a story. My family likes to call that an oops, a UPS, an unprovoked story. But it's not an unprovoked story. If you listen to the story, it's actually an answer to the question that you were asking. Okay, maybe it should have just been yes or no. Maybe it didn't need an elaborate story. But for me, in those situations, the story tells a lot more about my answer to the question than just answering the question. So I want you to think about that. Both chapters refer to us arguing from the point of and about our values. Those values are where we are persuaded. If you don't share values with someone, or you can't reach them to tap into what they value, you're not going to be successful in your argumentation. And both chapters also mention ethics. The idea that there is a set of ethics that goes along with argumentation, that goes along with rhetoric, that are not supposed to be debatable, and yet are. Our world sort of shifted in about 2015, and it's been difficult to work with classes such as argumentation, advocacy, persuasion, social movements, rhetoric, and so on, because it's hard to say that A plus B equals C like we used to be able to do. Now it's more like 1 + 1 = 5, and I'm not sure how we got there. So trying to pull apart the logic of those shifts in how we debate and how we argue in the public sphere is key. And so this skill is an incredibly important one for you to have. Now, I am going to put up a question on Blackboard. I will be giving you until next Thursday at 11:59 p.m. at the end of the day, 11:59 p.m. Next Thursday to answer it. It's going to be, again, a discussion question, not a question that's going to be difficult for you to answer. But I do hope you learn something while you answer it. Week 3 requires us to be into chapters 3 and 4. So I'm hoping that this Labor Day weekend, when we are thanking everybody for what we need to thank them for, you might also be perhaps cracking the book open and looking into chapters 3 and 4. I'm sorry, I'm so proud of myself because the cats have been crazy, and yet I seem to have gotten through the lecture. Looks like it. So be looking for that Blackboard assignment. It'll be put up sometime tonight. And again, do not feel like you have to do all of this before, Friday, tomorrow, or before even the end of the weekend. You do have until next Thursday at 11:59 p.m. to respond. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, and threats may be directed to me via email, but most of you have found out that I am much better with texting than I am with email. But hopefully your second week of school went really well, and I'll be talking to you sooner rather than later for chapters 3 and 4.